Hello, everyone. I'm afraid I'm not a professor. I'm just Gilly Wilford. But anyway, I really enjoyed reading and writing about this section, which I've called the Prime Minister, or how just about everyone was in the wrong, one way or another, most of the time. So we start these chapters at the halfway point of the book. We've met all the main characters and seen how the parallel stories, so aptly described by Ginny Grinovich, have collided. And when these tram lines meet, then the sparks fly. And we have seen how badly the interaction between Lopez and the great house of Omnium has played out. At the start of this section, Lopez has fought and lost the Silverbridge by-election. Arthur Fletcher, Emily's erstwhile suitor, has been elected. Lopez's financial transactions have been sufficiently unsuccessful as to make a return to Manchester Square a necessity. The Duke is continuing unhappily as Prime Minister, with Glencora champing at the bit to make her husband a great man in her mould. Emily, after less than a year, is beginning to regret her marriage. Things are hotting up. So we start with chapter 41. As so often with Trollope, government for him is about the people and the social scene, and boring old politics are largely avoided, and so it is here. Sir Orlando has resigned grumpily from the government, and we have to bear in mind that perhaps he was really rather prescient about those gunboats, because we're in the latter part of the 19th century now. And the parliamentary session comes to an early end, much to the annoyance of many Londoners. This is the time for anyone who is anyone to leave the city and head for their country estates. Our old chum Phineas Finn is promoted to the Admiralty, which means that he heads for the ocean blue. So in chapter 42, we find there'll be no great entertainments at Gatherum this year, and this will suit Plantagenet very well. Glencora thinks she's being very clever to take him at his word and invites Lady Rosina de Courcy to be their sole guest. But Plantagenet is delighted at the idea of a quiet Darby and Jones sort of summer. So Glencora realises that her intended revenge is not really going to work. So then, apart from an awkward conversation about whether the Duchess should have interfered with the election, it looks as though it'll be a gentle summer. And then, da-da, the letter from Lopez arrives, and a very tough conversation ensues. He was the man whom you selected to be your candidate for the borough in opposition to my wishes, and whom you continued to support in direct disobedience to my orders. Oh, surely, Plantagenet, we've had all that out about disobedience before. You cannot have such things out, as you call it. Evil doing will not bury itself out of the way and be done with. Do you feel no shame at having your name mentioned a score of times with reprobation, as that man mentions it? At being written about by such a man as that? Do you want to make me roll in the gutter because I mistook him for a gentleman? That was not all, nor half. In your eagerness to serve such a miserable creature as this, you forgot my entreaties, my commands, my position. The various conversations that ensue show how differently the Duke and Duchess view the world. She had indeed directly disobeyed him, but she is happy to bear the blame for this, while he, with his over-delicate sense of honour, cannot countenance the idea that her name should be mentioned by anyone. They both know that Lopez has no right to ask for the money, but while she would be willing to tell him so, his honour impels him to be over-scrupulous and pay the money. Sir Ferdinand has now been paid twice, and this action will result in consequences for both men. In chapter 43, we leave Matching for London and see how Ferdinand uses the £500 from the Duke to lure Sextus Parker into further dangerous speculation. So far, just every time when all has seemed lost, Lopez has managed to pull some more money from somewhere and create a false sense of security. He has fooled his father-in-law as well, but not his wife, who has recognised deceit in his tone of voice. This time, Lopez uses actual money to buy actual goods, Cowrie gum, whatever that is, and again hopes to make a killing. I think that by this time, both Ferdinand and to a lesser extent Sextus were addicted to speculating. It is gambling, and we know that is addictive. Lopez tells Emily that they will holiday at Dovercourt, which I think is probably Southend, because he mentions a rather down market place in Essex. And she realises how much she will miss the happy summers in Herefordshire. There is uneasiness all round. By now, Lopez seems to create a miasma of misfortune as he goes. In chapter 44, Mr. Wharton begins to think about how he will protect Emily in the future, not by giving Lopez a large sum with which to speculate, but by settling money on her and her children. Ferdinand and Emily fall out as she explains that she won't ask her father for money and get round him as Lopez wants. I can't tell him in the same breath that you are rich and that you want money. Lopez loses his temper. The mask slips and he swears at her. This really is the beginning of the end for Emily. All talk now seems to be of money. Before their marriage, he had talked to her of books and especially of poetry. Now she was awake. Her dream was over. The conversation with Mr. Wharton is not satisfactory for Lopez, and he is asked to send a schedule of his assets and liabilities to Mr. Wharton in Herefordshire. In chapter 45, while Mr. Wharton has a slightly uncomfortable time in Herefordshire and waits to hear from Lopez, he and Emily are at Dovercourt. Lopez teaches himself to regard the old man as a robber and himself as a victim. Emily meets the Parkers. And after another quarrel with Emily, Lopez at last writes to Mr. Wharton and decides to describe his business by quoting from The Merchant of Venice. This is quite amusing, really, considering Mr. Wharton's prejudice against Jews. He admits that he is trading beyond his capital. Mrs. Parker has Lopez's measure. She is the one person who sums him up accurately. He wants to get rich too quick. And they goes and buys things that they haven't got the money to pay for and then waits to see if they'll turn up trumps. Isn't that gambling? Well, in my view, it is. And it's also insolvent and probably fraudulent trading. And I'll talk a bit about that later. Emily, who has never thought about money and business before, likes Mrs. Parker, but is alarmed by her conversation. Emily has an uncomfortable time on holiday, learning about the sort of economies that don't show, while pretending to the world that you are rich. She is now desperately unhappy, unable to pay the butcher and learning hard truths from Mrs. Parker. Mr. Wharton responds to Lopez's letter. I do not know that I feel disposed to confide the savings of my life to assist so very doubtful an enterprise. Well, I certainly wouldn't lend Lopez any money. Emily increasingly realizes that she no longer loves her husband. Then, in chapter 48, they return to London and the dinner party at Manchester Square takes place with bought-in food. The staff at Manchester Square are all horrified. Emily is distraught at having to entertain Lizzie Eustace, among others of dubious reputation. Mr. Wharton comes home in the middle of it, and Emily greets him with floods of tears. Lopez, meanwhile, is hoping to befriend Lizzie and get her to invest her money with him. And now we come to a bit of blackmail. £20,000, or I take my wife to Guatemala. This is a lengthy negotiation between Lopez and Mr. Wharton, and there were 2 months of uncertainty until, just before Christmas, Emily's baby was born and died after 2 days. Nothing thrives that I have to do with, says Lopez. But even this tragedy cannot bring them back to harmony together. Now, too, the bills for Lopez's dinner and his other outward signs of wealth come into Mr. Wharton. Lopez was, indeed, a fraud. So in chapter 50, we find how could we possibly expect Lizzie Eustace to know something mischievous and not to make mischief of it. Here we see the tracks colliding again, and Quintus' slide of the People's Banner is the means for the collision. He pays for the information by advice to Lizzie. And as to embarking your money with Ferdinand Lopez, I wouldn't do it. Don't, Lady Eustace. I can't say any more, but don't. I never mention names, but don't. The People's Banner goes to town with a very cleverly worded article, not accusing, but just asking about the £500 payment. The Duke, who's very thin-skinned, is in torment and seeks advice from his friends at Matching. They all realise, of course, that it was Glencora who caused the problem, but they know that the Duke would never let her name be mixed up in this. While his friends and advisers are coddling the Duke, Glencora finds out about the article and states that she's quite happy to be blamed for the affair. Her robust approach contrasts with his. Look, if all the ministers in England were to give up as soon as their wives do foolish things, that question about carrying on the Queen's government would become very difficult. And there are others just as bad as me, only I don't think they get blown up so much. You do now as I ask you. And he, I couldn't do it, Cora. A man's wife should be talked about by no one. Oh, that's highfalutin, Plantagenet. And then Quintus Slide, after quite an entertaining conversation with Lopez, gets hold of his letters, the copies he's made, and he gets to work in earnest now that he has proof. Poor Plantagenet. By chapter 52, we're back in Manchester Square. The unhappy couple and sorrowful father are still uneasily yoked together. Then Mr. Wharton learns from the paper that Lopez got the £500 from the Duke. And after an unpleasant conversation with Mrs. Roby about how she could have introduced such a rogue into the family, Mr. Wharton confronts Lopez. I paid your electioneering expenses. Oh, you certainly subscribed £500 towards them, Mr. Wharton. As this indicates, Lopez decides to take a high-handed approach and refuses to accept that he has defrauded anyone. Poor Mr. Wharton is more or less forced out of his house, since Lopez refuses to leave without Emily, and anyway, he hasn't got anywhere to take her. Oh dear, what a mess. In chapter 53, the final chapter of this section tonight, Lopez is negotiating with the Guatemalan mining company and now asks Mr. Wharton for £5,000 to buy the shares to which he must subscribe in order to get the job. Mr. Wharton thinks this is not too high a price to pay to be rid of this terrible incubus, but only on the condition that Lopez agrees, in writing, to leave Emily and never trouble her again. Mr. Lopez realizes, of course, that the mining company is pretty shaky. I will risk the money, or rather, I will consent absolutely to throw it away, as it will be thrown away, if it can be managed that he shall in truth go to this place without his wife. And there we are. Everyone is unhappy, and there seems to be no way out of this mess. The next chapter is entitled Lizzie. Will she be the answer? Now, why did I call this how just about everyone was in the wrong one way or another? Let's consider the dramatis personae. Everett Wharton, he's abroad in this part, but he was lazy and careless and happy to sponge off his father's hard-earned money. He made a friend of Ferdinand and introduced him to Emily without bothering to think whether Ferdinand was a PLU. And for American listeners, you may not know this expression, a person like us. Mrs. Roby, fond of intrigue and presents, fostered the relationship because it pleased her to be given things and also to go against Mr. Wharton. Mr. Wharton recognised the unsuitability of the marriage, but wasted time on prejudice rather than on finding out, as he jolly well should have done, whether Lopez's business was on a firm footing. I mean, this just horrifies me that he could have let Emily marry him without knowing anything about what Lopez did. Of course, he should have said they could marry when Lopez could give solid proof that he could support a wife, rather than giving in so precipitately. Emily thought she knew best and was too proud and also, let's face it, infatuated with Lopez's good looks to think straight and be prepared to wait. And here I do feel that wise counsel from her father might have helped her a lot. Plantagenet Palliser, he felt himself to be unfitted to be Prime Minister, was too thin-skinned to cope with criticism, and yet too mulish to take advice when it was offered. Despite loving his wife dearly, he didn't know how to curtail her wild ideas and downright disobedience, and yet he refused to let her shoulder the blame for her actions. Glencora, I do think she behaved badly. It was ridiculous to try to curry favour by indiscriminate and overblown entertaining. A few good friends and parliamentary supporters at Matching would have been a far more effective way to entrench her husband's position, as he knew. She could have listened to her husband and avoided the ridicule she incurred. She was pig-headed and wrong about the election, and persisted in doing just what she knew her husband didn't want, and refused to understand the excellent reasons he had for opposing her schemes for a castle candidate. This goes right back to the 1832 Reform Act. I do like that she said sorry, though. Quintus Slide. He created a lot of bother for Plantagenet and may well create more. But was he wrong to bring to light what he clearly saw as interfering in an election? Probably not in the first instance, but perhaps he should have modified his stance once he realised that the money was paid after the election and in response to an insolent letter from Lopez. Of course, he was dying to pay back the Duke for failing to invite him to Gatherum. Sextus Parker was weak and led by Ferdinand, but was also greedy enough to want to get rich too quick and put his own family in jeopardy by listening to and joining in Ferdinand's schemes. And then Ferdinand Lopez, well, he's clearly the arch villain here. He was in love with Emily, but rushed into a marriage that he couldn't afford. In my view, he also should have hired a good accountant. He knowingly traded insolvent and carried on trading until it was clearly fraudulent, which is a criminal offence these days at any rate. He allowed his greed to overshadow his love for Emily and to alienate the father-in-law whom he most needed as an ally. I first read The Prime Minister when I was working in the city, and I was only too aware of some of the shady trading that went on. I was involved in helping to uncover some of the activities that caused the near collapse of Lloyd's, which was quite a scary and interesting time. Greed and gambling go hand in hand, and the Nick Leeson scandal, whose fraudulent speculation caused the collapse of Barings Bank in 1995, showed how close to reality Trollope was when he created Lopez. Like Lopez, Leeson would have been a hero, of course, if his speculations paid off, and the wealthy men with whom he worked would all have benefited from allowing him to play such a dangerous game. And then Arthur Fletcher, well, he's basically Prince Charming, always the hardest part to play in the pantomime. I wonder if he's a hero. One last word on Ferdinand Lopez. He does rather remind me of Don Giovanni, not because he was a philanderer, but because he has clearly had successes in the past. But once the action opens, everything seems to start going wrong for him, just as it does for the Don in Mozart's opera. We meet him at the pinnacle of his success. And alas, the only way to go from a pinnacle is down. And finally, just to say, The Prime Minister was not a huge success when it was published. Trollope's great skill was characterization, and allegedly, Plantagenet's character was not one in whom people felt much interest. The book was said to lack political impetus, and of course, against the background of the actual politics of the time and the struggles between the two great statesmen, Gladstone and Disraeli, that were actually happening, the Duke's coalition may have suggested that truth was more interesting than fiction. It has been suggested by some reviewers that the link between the two stories is flimsy. I have to say, it works for me. I've read this book a great many times and always with tremendous pleasure. I believe in the Duke and Duchess, and I want to shake Emily and have a few quiet words with her father, maybe about balance sheets. As for Ferdinand Lopez, I met him many times in firms that I visited, or perhaps he was showing off in city pubs after work. I can absolutely believe that he wanted to get on as an MP and that he might have charmed a duchess or two in order to do so. It's real, all right, and I think it's gripping stuff too. So I've got some discussion questions. Dominic showed me how to get them up on the screen, and I might be able to remember or I might not. Things we might like to discuss. Trollope wanted us to feel that he had developed the characters of Plantagenet and Glencora as they appeared in each book. Do you think he was successful? And who do you think was in the wrong most? Lopez felt that Emily and her father were in league against him. And do you think this is a justified complaint? This book sheds a light on some of the goings-on. I've missed out in the city. Do you think it should be prescribed reading for anyone setting up as a stockbroker? And finally, on a scale of 1 to 10, just how thrilled are you to see Lizzie Eustace crop up again? Thank you.